carbohydrates. Most of these will be words that you've probably heard of before. Carbohydrates, lipids. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, lipids. Proteins, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Nucleic acids, maybe if you, in a previous, maybe like life science class, you maybe talked about a cell and it's had a nucleus. Are things like DNA and RNA. Okay? Biosynthesis is the putting together of substances by living things. So when you eat food or a living thing takes in food, it digests it and breaks it down into the raw materials and then puts it together to make them. You know? So when you eat, for instance, beef, your body will digest the beef down to amino acids, and then your DNA that we'll talk about will determine how you're going to assemble those amino acids into protein that makes up your body. Okay? It'll be very similar to every other human being, but it would be different than a cow. So just because you ate meat doesn't mean that you're going to end up looking like a cow because of that. You're going to take these same building blocks but assemble them in a different way to make you. So bio means what? It means life, right? And synthesis means what? Kind of like put together, right? To make something. So this is when living things put together things, and we're going to see a lot of these that we talk about it up here in this list. They're going to take like building blocks and make other things from those building blocks. Now, what functions do these organic compounds serve? Structural is one of those. Structures that make up the cell, like the cell membrane and all the different structures that we have inside of the cell. Some of them are going to serve as enzymes. They control chemical reactions. They help speed up chemical reactions that ordinarily wouldn't take place under those conditions. So that's what we mean by an enzyme, like a catalyst. Some of them are for storage. Like things that we'll talk about will be fats. We store a lot of ours for long-term use in form of fat. Short-term, we can use things like, we have like glycogen. People who run, or like let's say do triathlons, do marathons and things like that, they need to kind of like tank up on chemicals that are going to supply energy over a long period of time. So carbohydrates is the first one that we're going to talk about. Look at the word carbohydrate, and let's think about what elements make up carbohydrate. The first part should give you a clue that it must be made out of carbon. Good. Okay? And then if something is a hydrate, or if you try to hydrate yourself, what does that mean you are taking in a lot of? What? You're trying to take up water, okay? What are the main elements that make up water? What's the formula for water? Yeah, H2O, right? Okay, so we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So those are going to be the elements that make up carbohydrates. Okay, so the name kind of gives you a clue as to what they are. Down here at the bottom is just a kind of like a structural model of glucose. This year we're going to learn about photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is going to be sort of like the main thing that plants do is to make glucose. We benefit by them making oxygen as well, but we're going to be making glucose. And then they can put those together and make other structures with that. So generally carbohydrates found in living things have twice as many hydrogens as they do oxygens. In other words, if I were to give you a formula for all the different kinds of carbohydrates, that's what you'll notice, is there seems to be always twice as many hydrogens as oxygens. Within the category of carbohydrates, you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. So we're going to start out with monosaccharides. What does the prefix mono mean? Means one, right? Means one. So this is going to be my building block of other kinds of carbohydrates. Glucose is an example of that. It's not the only monosaccharide, but it's probably going to be the one we're going to talk about probably more than anything else, is glucose. So because it's the building block, we often refer to them as being simple sugars as opposed to complex sugars. I can put simple sugars into my bloodstream, as long as I don't put too much of it there, but I can't put it into my bloodstream directly because it doesn't need to be digested. It's already in its simplest form, and my body can do something with it. I can get energy out of it. Disaccharides, di means what? Two. So this would be two glucose molecules put together to make a disaccharide. And the process, so we call this a double sugar. There's two monosaccharides put together. Sucrose is going to be our example. So whether the table sugar, this is table sugar, whether this is table sugar that comes from what or what? What are the two places that we get table sugar from? Long skinny stalks called what? Sugar cane. Or if you go up in north of here in the U.S., up to North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, along the Red River, they grow sugar, starts with a B, sugar beets. They're about this big around, about this big around, and they get sugar out of that. So it primarily comes from two sources. The sugar tastes exactly the same because it is exactly the same. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Sucrose is sucrose. Now, I'm sure there are other places to get sucrose from in other countries, but that's what we use here. Now, in the process of making a disaccharide, the process, and we'll talk about this more later on, is, for instance, for a sugar cane, doesn't make sucrose directly. It makes glucose, and it makes fructose. Makes two kinds of simple sugars. And when you put them together, that means we're going to synthesize a bigger molecule. In the process of making this bigger molecule, it's going to remove water. How do I know? Because it says that right here. Dehydrated. If you become dehydrated, what does that mean? You don't have enough water, right? We've lost some water. So in this process, I have it shown up here. This is the formula for a monosaccharide. Could be glucose or fructose, doesn't matter. We're taking two of those. So if I add them together, C6 plus C6 gives me C12. H12 plus H12 gives me H24. O6 plus O6 gives me O12. Okay, so far makes sense? But to make a disaccharide, I need to subtract water. So in the process, water is going to be extracted out of it. It's going to take that hydrogen and that OH, that's H2O, out between those two molecules and then attach them together. And so if I subtract H2O out of it, I'm not subtracting anything from carbon, so it's still C12. It goes from H24 to H2. I'm subtracting H2, become H22. O12 minus 1 oxygen is O11. That's the formula for sucrose, or a disaccharide. that's what they're talking about there. It's a process where I'm making a synthesize, usually makes put together to make a bigger molecule, but in this particular example, we put them together and subtract water out of the process. So that's what we mean by dehydration synthesis. The reverse has to happen if I eat food that has a sucrose in it. You know, if I put sprinkle sugar on my Wheaties or whatever in the morning with my cereal, or I like Cheerios, so I put it on my Cheerios. For my body to be able to use that sucrose, it needs to be broken back down into 2 monosaccharides before I can absorb it into my body. It won't go in as a disaccharide. Oh, that's right, my video monitor is leaving as well. Is it still going?
Yep.
Good.
Should be fine.
So we have to do the reverse. So we're going to take this, add water to it, and make 2 monosaccharides. Well, run well. And this is also a hot day too, isn't it? Supposed to get up to like 92. I'm glad I'm not running. I'm glad they are, but not me. Okay, so it'll end up forming a glucose and a fructose. Again, so I broke it apart. That can be absorbed into my bloodstream, and the cells can actually use it directly as energy. Another kind of carbohydrate are what we call polysaccharides. Poly means what? It means many. So we're going to put a bunch of these monosaccharides together to make a much bigger molecule. Okay? And one of those is starch. So if you had pasta, would be an example of something that has a lot of starch in it. People who are running, like they are, or running greater distances, they want to eat a lot of pasta beforehand. Not just hour before they run. Usually, you know, like if they're going to run today, they probably should have been doing that last night. I had a friend in Phoenix that liked to do the triathlons, you know, where you run, you bike, and you swim. And when we moved up here, I hadn't seen him for a while, and he wanted to see us, but at the same time use it as a ulterior motive was to be participating in the Omaha Triathlon. So he came up here, then we picked him up at the hotel, and he was performing or was participating the next day. And I asked him, "Where do you want to eat?" So this was downtown. So where would you eat downtown where you could do a lot of that? What? Spaghetti Works? You got it. That's where we went. And that's what all he ordered was lots of pasta. Now he's a real skinny guy. I mean, he's much skinnier than I am. But he was tanking up on pasta because starches store a lot of energy. Now, you can store a lot of temporary energy in glycogen. Our liver is involved in that process. We'll learn more about that later. Now, another way of putting these monosaccharides together, plants do this. They make cellulose. That's the part, like if you have a piece of wood, that's almost all cellulose. The rest of the plant's cells have pretty much died and dried up. So you have cellulose. Here's another one. It produces bulk and roughage. For us, it's a good thing. We can't digest cellulose. Our body doesn't have any way of digesting cellulose. Also, termites have no way of digesting cellulose. When they eat wood in somebody's houses, they can't digest cellulose. So how can they live? They have little microorganisms living in their stomachs that can digest cellulose. So they're providing a home for these organisms. This microorganism digests the cellulose and the termite benefits. So if I were wanting to kill termites, all I would need to do what? Is do what? Yeah, just kill the little things inside their stomachs, and they would starve to death. They could eat a whole house and still starve to death. Because they're not getting any energy out of that. That's kind of an interesting thing, part of biology. You learn that quite often there's some animals have to live together for them both to survive. And God made it to be that way. Another kind of polysaccharide that we will talk about is when we're talking about particularly like crayfish, lobsters, crayfish, or what's the other name we call them? Crawdads, I guess is what we call them here. Crawdads. Their shell is actually a polysaccharide called chitin. It's the CH is pronounced with like a K sound, so it's like chitin. But that's another polysaccharide. So let's talk about what do we know about the group called carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are often used for structure, like in plants, for instance. They're also used as a source of energy, like starches are a source of energy. And we do store some of that, for later use. So that's the role of carbohydrates or functions of carbohydrates in living things. Any questions? Our next topic are the lipids. Have any of you heard that word before you read it in the book? Okay, lipids?
Yes, because in an anime I like, this chick uses like the lipids or whatever as like her superpower, and she can create stuff.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Now, the interesting thing about this particular molecule is they're only slightly soluble in water. Slightly. We would probably say they're not. If you had a lipid, which would be like fats and oils and things like that, if you had oil on your hand, can you wash it off with just water? It doesn't work, does it? You need to have soap, right? You need to have soap. And so these have a really unique molecule that allows us to, where they're not soluble in water, but we can make them soluble if we do certain things. And we'll talk about that. These are ways of storing energy that takes up less space than like starches do. So if you need to store stuff for a lot longer period of time, you would store it as a lipid. They're often often used as for structural, but they also store energy. So we can talk about a few of those. Now, the simplest one that we want to talk about are what we call the fatty acids. They're often like building blocks for these other things that we're going to talk about. Just like monosaccharides were building blocks for carbohydrates, these are kind of like building blocks for other lipids. These are found in animal tissue. They're also found in dairy products, but it's usually just, it's not like they're not found in plants, but animals have a whole lot more of these. They store energy, as what we've already talked about. Now, here is a kind of a structural model of a fatty acid, and it has two ends. The top end is a molecule that's, we say it's polar. In other words, there's one end is positive, one end is negative, so it's polar, and it's attracted to water. This word right here, hydrophilic, means attracted to water. Hydro has something to do with what? Like water, right? Like a hydroelectric dam has something to do with water, right? We have water behind a dam that runs the turbine making electricity. Now, filling. We have all these words for love that are used in the Greek. We have agape, and we have phileo, and we have eros. Well, this is the phileo is just another kind of word for love, like Philadelphia. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is often called the city of brotherly love or something like that. But it has something to do with love. So this end of the molecule is water loving. That's what the word means, water loving end. The other end is hydrophobic. If you have a phobia, you have a fear of things, right? So they're not afraid of them, but they are repelled by water. If we mix those with the right chemicals, we can actually make a soap out of that. So we can take something that has a water-soluble end and a water-repelling end and convert it into a molecule that works good as a soap. My mother, up till I'm pretty sure I was in maybe about the time I was in high school, she would make her own homemade soap. My dad was a pastor, and we would have people in the church. We lived in a rural area a lot of the time, and so the way the people in the church would bless our family is they would sometimes give us like half of a pig, half of a hog. Well, pigs have a lot of fat on the outside, and from that you can make something called lard, which is animal fat. Well, if you take animal fat and you mix it with lye, have you ever heard of lye soap? Okay, you mix it with lye, react it would be a better way of saying it. React it with lye, you can make homemade soap. And it is really good soap. Maybe not the best always on your skin, because if you don't get the mix just right, you might have a little bit of extra lye left over. And lye is the active ingredient in Drano, what we use to clean out drains, which eats protein, right? Hair and stuff like that. Well, if you get that on your skin, it dissolves your skin. If you had just straight lye, it would dissolve your skin. So you have to make sure that you get it mixed right. So it is a little harsh on the skin, but man, it's awesome. It's awesome at taking out like oily stains and stuff like that, because it has a water-soluble end and a grease-soluble end. The end that is repelled by water is attracted to grease. Another thing that you will find is that the most abundant of the lipids is something called triglycerides. Have any of you ever had tests done where they were trying to find out your cholesterol and stuff like that? Maybe your parents have, but and one of the tests for it is like your triglycerides. My triglycerides are high, or my triglycerides are low, or something like that. So that's in this lipid category. Notice here that you have dehydration synthesis again, to go from here to here, and a hydrolysis to go the other way. Now, hydrolysis, hydro means water, but one thing that you may want to write down, that we're going to see this part of a word over and over again this year, and it's this. L-Y-S-I-S. It's going to be at the end of a lot of different words. Here it's at the end of water, and it means to split. Lysis means to split. So we're going to split something up into its parts by adding water in the reaction. So here are fatty acids that are being put together to make a triglyceride. So fatty acids are kind of like the building block of triglycerides. So in the reaction to go from here to here, it's going to get rid of or take out water that's in between the molecules, so to speak, and make a triglyceride. When your body needs it, it will do the reverse. It will split them up with water to make 3 different fatty acids. So when it comes to fats, we can talk about saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats means that everything inside the molecule, we don't have one of those up here, everything inside the molecules is just single bonds. There's no double bonds. If you remember, we talked a little bit about that last year. Single bonds between the carbon atoms. Saturated fats aren't as good for us as unsaturated fats. The one way to distinguish if a fat is saturated is it solids at room temperature. So what would be some examples? Well, like the lard I talked about. You can actually buy lard. And butter is an example. Now that doesn't mean butter is bad for you, but a lot of it's not good for you. The other kind of fats are unsaturated fats. That means inside the molecule, like in this example here, they have some places where they have double bonds. And the more double bonds they have, the more unsaturated it is. And by those molecules happen to be liquids at room temperatures. We often refer to those like the word oils, like there's corn oil, peanut oil, palm oil. Some of them are better for us than others. Like I think there's also canola oil is another one. Peanut oil, like peanut oil is one that we often, I think people are using now to like make French fries, right? Peanut oil. It used to be. I mean, originally it was actually like lard. Well, that's not as good for us, so that's why all the restaurants that make French fries, have switched over to other kinds of oils, because unsaturated fats are better for us than saturated. Saturated is not bad for us, but the other one's better. Triglycerides turns out to be the most abundant type of lipid that's in your body. So when they measure that, when they give these tests, triglycerides, I could pull up my tests. I have these tests done every year, and that way they can keep track of my cholesterol and my triglycerides and make sure I stay healthy. And a triglyceride has the word tri in front of it, which means, like a triangle has how many angles? 3. So this is a triglyceride. It has 3 fatty acids put together. So here's 3 of them in this one. Here are 3 separate ones that we're putting, or not separate ones, we're making into a triglyceride. Another kind of lipids are the phospholipids. This name's going to come up a bunch when we talk about the cell membrane. Yesterday in that video I showed you, she talked about the cell membrane and when we have diffusion, osmosis taking place, stuff that goes through that. The phospholipids are used to make up the cell membrane. So they will have a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end, which is really important in a cell keeping on things on the inside that need to stay on the inside, and things that we don't want on the inside, keeping them on the outside. So that membrane helps us do that. It's made out of phospholipids. So it's essential in the formation and structure of the cell membrane, like I just talked about. Another one of these lipids are the steroids. Okay? And steroids, they function like, as it says up here, chemical messengers. They're produced in one part of the body, and they send a message to other parts of the body to do something. And your sex hormones are examples of steroids. So being on steroids means one thing, but we're all on steroids. just not those kinds. Those are anabolic steroids, which are made, for making muscle and stuff like that. These are chemical messengers that tell other parts of the body to do that. Like, for instance, estrogen, when you go through puberty and girls, you start producing a lot more estrogen. That's what changes you from a girl into a woman. It's chemical messengers that tell certain parts of the body to do certain things. So that's the reason why you don't look like girls anymore. The messengers have been sent out. Guys produce testosterone. That makes them grow beards and hair on their body and things like that. And makes them be typically more muscular because of that. That is just part of these messengers going out and telling our bodies, wake up, it's time to become an adult. So the lipids are structural. So they do play that role for some of the structures like cell membrane. They do store energy, like fats store energy for long periods of time. And they also serve as a way to store materials for a later point in time, for something else that I do. Proteins, another organic molecule. Their building blocks are called amino acids. Amino acids. And proteins, like meat, for instance, would be a good example of that. So when you eat, let's say, beef or chicken or anything that tastes like chicken, like, what's it, frog legs? Somebody was talking about frog legs this morning. I don't know where they were at. Oh, it was Mrs. Schrag was saying that when she grew up on the mission field, I think it was, that was their special Sunday dinner, was always to have frog legs. And what does he say it tastes like? Chicken, So many things seem to taste like chicken. But whatever meat that you eat, your body will digest it and break it down into its simplest pieces called amino acids, and then your body will then rebuild, put them together in the right thing to make you. Whatever kind of proteins your body needs, it'll put the right ones together to make you. And so we're taking a whole bunch of these amino acids, putting them together, and since we have many, that's poly, and the kind of bond referred to as a peptide bond. So these are called polypeptide bonds that make these proteins. And the proteins can have many different shapes. Like one of these amino acids might be attracted to the very next amino acids and fold over and become more compact. They do all kinds of different things because of their properties that they have. But the amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So proteins also function as enzymes. They control chemical reactions. Very important job that they do. So that's a real short section. They're structural. Yeah, muscles make up the shape of help, shape our body. Enzymes, they do control chemical reactions. Only the proteins do that. They're not a source of energy, even though they can be a source of energy. If, for instance, if somebody were starving, the first they would use is their fat reserves, if they have any. Somebody who is, is storing an awful lot of fat, you will sometimes notice that their eyes kind of protrude out of their head. Even the Bible uses that word. They have eyes that kind of bulge out of their head because they're eating a lot and they're storing a lot of fat. But if you notice, the reverse is true of somebody who's starving to death. Their eyes are quite sunken into their head. Well, right behind your eyeballs is one of the places we store fat. Not a lot, but we do. We tend to store more around here is where most people store their fat, but you store it in other parts of your body as well. it's a storage material, you know, for protein. And when you have used up all your fat reserves, your body then will start to break down protein for energy. Not a great source of energy, your own protein. So they start getting thinner and thinner and thinner, but it's keeping them alive. Now, eventually, you'll get to a point where you can't use up the muscles that you need to keep you alive. You know, you kind of get to some point where, okay, and they starve to death, we say. Nucleic acids are our last one. These are, as the name implies, are found inside the nucleus of the cell. You probably learned about the nucleus, at least of a cell, probably in the past, maybe life science or something like that. The nucleic acids are the way one generation passes on their information to the next generation. Your parents gave some of their information, each of them, to make you. So that's why you look the way you do, because you're a mix of the information that both parents, but that's how they pass the information on in a molecule, in the molecules of nucleic acid. And the DNA, as we'll talk about here in a moment, it contains a complete blueprint for everything about your body. Everything about it. Every cell in your body has a complete set of information. It only needs part of it, but every cell has the whole thing. The only ones that don't are the sex cells. You know, women make eggs, they only have half a set. Men make sperm, they only make half a set. And they put the two sets together, and now we have a complete blueprint for the next generation. The two men that are responsible for figuring out how a nucleic acid molecule, or what it looks like, were a guy his last name was Watson and Crick. We talk about the model that they came up with, and it looks like, this is the DNA molecule that they came up with. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay? So deoxy, if you put a D in front of it, it means what? Like without, right? So it's without some oxygen. So in other words, this sugar, ribo, is a ribose sugar, has a little less oxygen in it than the other kind. And its structure is a double helix. Helix means to do this, a spiral. So it's two spirals going around each other because it's double, and they're connected like rungs of a ladder. So imagine a ladder that's been twisted. That's kind of the shape of a DNA molecule, like a twisted ladder, and the rungs of the ladder, or rungs of these parted together, are called nucleotides. Okay? And then we have something called bases as well. The nucleotide has a sugar part, that's the ribose part, and then they have another part called the phosphate, that means it has phosphorus and oxygen in it. And then they have bases. The bases are 4 kinds. There's 4 different kind of bases. That's all there are, just 4. You'd think, how can there be that many different kinds of information, pieces of information, if I'm only using 4? Believe it or not, that's sufficient. And you're dismissed.